Hello again. I noticed a while back that whilst we have numerous resources on world building, astronomy, geology, maps, and languages online, there is very little on world building cultures. Culture building is one of my favourite parts of the world building process, so I thought I would share how I would build a culture from scratch. Disclaimer: if you hear any advice or methodology I give and think that sounds completely stupid, you don't have to use it. Everything here is purely my own opinion and method in world building. Take what you want and throw out the rest. If you want to ignore realistic stuff like never splitting your rivers, evil empires being stupid, and mountains doing U-turns, absolutely ignore those things. It's your world, you can do whatever the hell you want with it. Also, I'm not an expert on literally any of this, so if you notice any stuff which is incorrect, please post it into the comments and I'll put together a corrections document for you to look at. So, that out of the way, how do I start world building a new culture? Well, I tend to start with what are called folkways and mores. These terms were first coined by one William Graham Sumner, who was a very interesting character in and of himself, to describe the values held by a culture. A folkway is the expectation of how to act. It is the expectation of how close to stand to someone when having a conversation, how loud to speak, how much eye contact. All these things are the folkways of a culture. They have no moral connotations, they're just how things like communicating, eating, exercise, etc., are went about in a culture. Breaking the folkways leads to mild disapproval, nothing too serious. Mores are much more severe than folkways. They are what's considered morally right and morally wrong in a culture. However, the term does not come from the word moral, they actually come from the Latin word for custom. Mores tend to be laws, and an extremely common one on earth is robbery. Stealing from someone is very often met with severe social disapproval and legal punishment for stealing. Folkways are really hard to work build. I'd recommend only changing them in small ways, as even the smallest change to a people's folkways for most cultures on Earth can lead to massive ramifications. For example, in Patrick Rothfuss's The Wise Man's Fear, the Edem are a culture which stand much closer to each other when talking than most people in the Western world, and they see public nudity as normal, also unlike in the Western world on Earth. The Adem have different folkways to us, they have different expectations of how to behave, which can make them seem strange to be alienated by the other cultures of their world. You can utilise this in your own world building and storytelling. Perhaps your culture sees the other peoples of your world as uncouth for showing so much skin. Perhaps they put on so much clothing that only their eyes are exposed, and only when in private or with close friends do they take off all those robes and shawls. Maybe this is why they don't have taverns or places where people can eat publicly, because that would mean showing their mouths to eat, so they only have their meals in privacy. Perhaps they prefer to hunt for themselves when they travel rather than embarrass someone's household by eating with them and therefore showing too much skin with someone they might not know. Notice how just by changing a single folkway, how much you've expected to clothe yourself, we can figure out so much about a culture and add a great deal of depth to them and their interactions with other peoples. This is why I say to only change folkways in small ways, as if you have a group of humans operate in drastically different ways, they can be difficult to relate to and have your characters, if you're writing some kind of story, interact with them. That being said, it's world building, you can do whatever you want, and if you're world building a culture which is a different species, you can do all sorts of fun things. For example, say you have a species which is covered in chitinous armor they use to defend themselves, except for a soft weak point at the back of the head which can be used to injure the species. A culture of this species may introduce themselves by showing the weak points at the back of their heads, thus showing trust between the two individuals to show the place they can be struck. With other races besides humans, the possibilities are quite literally limitless. While folkways are more standard practices or customs which have no moral or ethical ramifications, mores are much more serious. Breaking a more is a severe offence in many cultures, and if they have a complex legal system, many mores can be punishable by law. Mores can range from what a culture thinks about stealing, trickery, heroism, resourcefulness, etc., all the way to murder and sacrifice. Mores tend to be big concepts, things which are important to a culture. A culture which values honour above all else will likely have severe social ramifications for breaking the honour codes, maybe exile or even imprisonment. For a new culture, I tend to start with a short briefing to get me started. We'll talk about how climate and the environment they live in can influence a culture over time. which can inspire new ideas for various peoples. For this sample culture, I'll take Renaissance Italy and Viking Age Scandinavia. If you're using analogues like I am here, I recommend using more than two to make your culture look unique yet familiar, and preferably from different parts of the world. A good example of using analogues is combining the Incan Empire, the Iroquois Confederacy, ancient Egypt, and say Aboriginal Australia. For unique analogues might be a little bit overkill, but it can lead to some cool combinations of different beliefs and traditions. So, Italy and Vikings. When I think Renaissance Italy, I think vanity, deceit, and political intrigue, with the edges of the map only getting bigger and bigger. Of the Vikings, I think unflinching bravery and or stupidity due to their religious beliefs, a love of sailing, fast boats which can sail on rivers and the ocean, opening up raiding inland areas, and of course raiding itself. Note, if you already have a basic idea of what a culture is like, use that. My interpretations of Renaissance Italy and the Vikings might be off, but it can give a unique flair to your fictional culture. So, let's build some mores to get started. More number one, trickery. This culture sees trickery and sleight of hand as virtues, and people who are good at these things are lauded, not shunned. All of the great heroes of this culture are thieves, with silver tongues, and always have another trick up their sleeves when things seem most dire. More number two, valor. Bravery and courage are valued in this culture. These people are willing to waltz into danger without a second thought, or so they are in stories. In the flesh, they might have a little bit more self-preservation. These folk are fearsome in battle for this, and in the gambling dens also. The warriors of this people are feared in many other nations, with their silvered axes and shields painted with visages of fire and ash. More number three, the sea. It is considered a severe breaking of the folkways and mores to never go on a sea voyage in this culture, and the warriors are always expected to go off and raid other lands in their strange, hasty boats. More number four, vanity. Alongside cards and the battlefield, trickery and courage are also seen in the grand ballrooms of this land. Nobles expertly maneuver the vast political web of this culture, renowned for boasting of their axe or shield skills, even if they have no such thing. The nobility wears fine silks from distant nations, hold up fronts of gold and silver, and parade around their wealth like they're begging for someone to rob them, which they might actually be. Notice how, with only four mores written down, we already have a very good image of this culture in our heads. There are people of bravery in the courts and the battlefield, where seafaring and trickery is lauded and raiding over lands is commonplace. I find this immensely useful for building a new culture from scratch. There's some 4 or 5 paragraphs, we already have a pretty good picture. Combine that with some unique folkways and maybe how they view one or two other peoples in your world, and we have a solid foundation to continue building. I highly recommend doing some cursory research into the culture you're inspired by, as lack of knowledge can lead to a use of stereotypes and generally boring overused concepts. However, you can accentuate and change some features, as how I drastically exaggerate the deceit and trickery aspects of this sample culture. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, you can like and subscribe. I know you heard those two words at least 100 times now from various different channels, but it really does help. Next time we'll be covering how environment and ecology affect your fictional culture, or maybe not. No promises on that one. Cheers!